some questions, and then sort of 20 minutes till the end we'll open up to the floor so people can ask some questions too. So let's crack going, and Francisco will ask the first question.
Okay. So, Tera, starting off, we want to ask you about your journey, about how you got to where you are today, what have been the best career decisions you've made, and as well, for example, some risks you've taken.
Great, thank you so much first of all, for having me here. It's such a delight to be speaking to all of you, but sadly not able to see many of you, obviously. But hopefully there'll be a moment and opportunity for that sometime in the future. So my journey is quite convoluted, might be a way to put it, or like a zigzag of some sorts. But I think that just shows that anybody that tells you they've had this incredible career is probably just post-rationalizing all the kind of logical steps of that and sort of hiding some of the slightly more serendipitous aspects of it. So I grew up in Finland, and I actually didn't study economics. I studied engineering. I did an master's in science, but I did it in a program that involved quite a lot of management and economics. So I got a feel for economics all the way back then. I then joined McKinsey, and as part of that, I also did an MBA, which of course had more economics in it as well. And for the following roughly 10 years, I worked at McKinsey as a consultant. I specifically worked mostly in commodity industries, in places like chemicals or oil and gas, where the application of microeconomics in particular, but also some of the macro aspects, were incredibly important for understanding business strategy and understanding where a particular business might be headed, what might be happening to prices in the future, how to think about scenarios around prices. So I ended up applying a lot of economics in that 10 years. And I ended up doing a lot of work in energy and climate change, because that was a particular area where markets were being liberalized. Clients were looking for advice on how to think about the future in a market-based system as opposed to a regulated system. And so that was all great fun. I then had 2 children, and this somewhat clashed with a career at McKinsey, I have to admit. And while I was able to work in a sort of expert role that required a little bit less travel, my husband was also a partner at McKinsey. And so we kind of decided that one of us has to sort of stay in London while the other one does all the traveling. And so I quite happily, I guess, at that point decided that I was going to be the one to stay in London and then look for jobs that would really be London based. And I was lucky enough to find a role at the then Department for Trade and Industry, precisely on energy and climate change, but sort of bringing my private sector expertise and skills to bear on government policy, which is very exciting. I think the vast majority of civil servants are very clever and very committed and incredibly ambitious, certainly at the senior level, but a lot of them don't have a lot of business experience. They don't necessarily understand how businesses work in the real world as opposed to how they might work in textbooks. And so part of my sort of contribution to energy and climate change at that point was to try and help colleagues understand what was actually happening in the markets, what was happening in the oil and the gas and the electricity markets. Why were businesses making certain decisions that politicians then wanted to shape through policy? That was really, really interesting. Of course, the politics of it was not something that I necessarily enjoyed, but the idea of advising politicians on what the rational thing to do to make the UK a better place was immensely rewarding and sort of motivating. I then moved on to be chief economist at the Department of Port Transport, and then moved back to the Department of Business Innovation and Skills to be Director General for economics, but also the rest of the analytical team, which was around statistics, operational research, social research, and also looked after a couple of policy areas around better regulation. So all of that was incredibly good fun and very rewarding in lots of different ways. And I got to work with some incredibly exciting and incredibly talented people in the civil service as well. But I did ultimately get a little bit frustrated with the fact that whatever our advice was, whatever the kind of perhaps correct answer to some of the policy questions would have been, that would have maximized welfare as far as we could tell, politics always overrode. Not surprisingly, I think that's the nature of a democracy. But I just felt that after the third time with the third minister or secretary of state, with the same issue having to make the same points and then still being somewhat ignored, I guess, for political reasons, I decided that it was time for something else. And so I ended up actually back at McKinsey, at the McKinsey Global Institute, which I knew would be a place where some of this kind of rational analysis and thorough thinking through of what actually does maximize welfare was something that was going to be valued, and where my sort of experience of both public and private sector would be valuable as well. And so I won't go into the detail of what's happened since at McKinsey. I've kind of slightly shifted around in terms of specific roles, but right now I'm sort of more focused on the UK and our research in the UK, very much on similar lines to McKinsey Global Institute, but taking those kind of big themes around whether it's future work and technology, artificial intelligence, or globalization and trade, or now obviously COVID, and sort of shining a spotlight on what the implications might be for the UK businesses, but also for the UK society.
Well, thank you very much for answering that. So I'm continuing. Maybe a question about what you think was the best decision out of all of those when you switched around in your career?
Yeah, gosh, it's incredibly difficult to say. Of course, with hindsight, I'll say all of them were good decisions. I'd say that in terms of kind of my sources of enjoyment in my current role at the moment, probably two very, very different things. The first thing was kind of hanging around at McKinsey for long enough to build up my network of really senior colleagues, well, who are back then were perhaps more like peers and right now are very senior, because that has allowed me to come back in a way that's, given me a lot of freedom, which has been, incredibly valuable as in my life circumstances, and having two children and whatever, it's useful to be able to have a bit of flexibility. But I would say more importantly, I think leaving energy and climate change as a topic, because I could have spent the rest of my life doing that, and I get frequent headhunter calls of people who want me to go back to energy and climate change. But quite frankly, I had realized that I was, having not properly studied macroeconomics at university, there were lots and lots of kind of economicsy topics that I wanted to explore still in the rest of my career that I wouldn't be able to explore if I stuck to energy and climate change. So even though the Department for Transport move might look as if it's a bit random, it was very explicitly about that kind of, I need to get out of this box. I want to broaden, I want to have a broader horizon around different sectors and different ways of looking at economics as a tool. In that case, to deliver public policy, but just kind of thinking beyond the box that I kind of felt I had perhaps been put into a little bit.
Of course. Go ahead, Katarina.
So much for those answers about your career. I'm pretty sure they probably have inspired a lot of the students here to, maybe consider consulting, or maybe consider a career in public sector, or in general, take risks. And we would really like to move on to sort of the COVID situation that's happening right now. And obviously, this is a major crisis in the economy, and from all the different perspectives. We just wanted you to talk a little bit about the crisis itself from the economic stance, how it's different from the previous crisis that we had and sort of the previous ones before that. And maybe after that, if you could touch also sort of what trends has COVID has touched on and maybe shaken up a bit, things like sustainability, digitalization, maybe a bit about inequality.
Sure, absolutely. So kind of broadly speaking, some of this will not be new news to you. We hear it kind of on the news a lot of the time, but this is, of course, the worst crisis in terms of economic output we have had in the UK since the 1700s or the 1800s. Not even since the Second World War. That kind of statement is true for the US and it's true for a lot of other European countries, but the UK actually did surprisingly well around the Second World War period. And so it's been an enormous hit to the economy, in a way kind of surprisingly enormous given the sort of relative normality of life that we've seen. And so that brings me to kind of the two dimensions on which this crisis is dramatically different from previous crises, in my opinion. So the first one is, it is first and foremost a public health crisis. So it's an external event that it's just because of the instruments available to governments to deal with the public health crisis, which is essentially lockdowns and social distancing, have enormous economic consequences, that it also has become an economic crisis. And that's something worth keeping in mind when we kind of try and think about how we might get out of this crisis and what the future might hold, because it isn't really until we've got to grips with the virus and how to properly almost like isolate the effects of it that we'll be able to return to normal work and normal outputs and normal kind of activity. And I'll come back to the point about, you know, the new normal or the next normal. Of course, it won't be exactly the same as it was before the crisis, but there's a sense in which, you know, the health aspects of this crisis are going to be driving a lot of the economic outcomes as well. The second way in which it has been unprecedented in a positive way is the degree to which governments have acted to really open the taps on liquidity, first of all, to avoid a banking crisis, to avoid cash flow crises among hundreds of thousands of millions of businesses, to avoid kind of unnecessary bankruptcies where you have completely viable businesses otherwise, but they just run out of cash, which is, of course, what typically does happen in a recession anyway. But governments have really stepped up, and central banks, their willingness and ability to support businesses and people through the crisis. And that, of course, includes providing cash flow support to individuals through the furlough scheme and the job support scheme, I think the new thing is called now. And we didn't see that in a lot of previous recessions with calamitous consequences, with lots of scarring in the economy, lots of reduction in potential output, lots of long-term unemployment, which is so much more, so kind of in a non-linear way, much worse than short-term unemployment. And so in many, many, many ways, you know, the government may have handled the health side of the crisis in a way that can be, you know, debated. But I think on the economic side of the crisis, you know, the broad thrust of policy has been super helpful, both here and in a lot of other countries. Now, looking forward then, I mean, it's a bit of a complex question, so a bit of a long answer. What are some of the consequences? I mean, there are probably too many to kind of fully reflect, but three things that I would highlight and can say a lot more about in a minute. The first one being, of course, the potentially reducing importance of place. If an increasing number of people can and decide to continue to work remotely, that will shape economic geography and agglomeration and all kinds of other aspects of work quite dramatically. But personally, I would say that it is way too early to draw any conclusions on that, and that there won't be a black and white answer. There won't be a like 100% of people work remotely or 100% of them don't. It'll be much more nuanced than that. First of all, only about 40% of people in the UK even can work remotely. Like if you're a bus driver or a dental nurse or whatever, you either work at your place of work or you don't work at all. And secondly, even though the people can work from home or remotely, some of them don't feel that it maximizes their productivity, or some of them have very difficult home circumstances, which just makes it completely impossible. That leads me to the second key phenomenon, and which I think all should be quite worried about, which is around inequality, and the fact that the COVID crisis has hit sort of manual, face-to-face, frontline, poorly paid and often poorly educated people much harder than it has hit those of us who can work essentially remotely. So highly educated people in professional services, in financial services, etc., even in some admin services. So there's a polarization that was already going on to a point in society, kind of globally and also in the UK. And I think sadly the crisis will emphasize and kind of accelerate that polarization, obviously subject to what government response and policies and also employer response and policies end up being. And I can say much more about that in a minute. The final thing, of course, it has accelerated technology adoption. Now, I am irritated by people who kind of assume that that applies to every single type of technology, that suddenly all the like hundreds of different ways in which businesses can and should be using technology to improve productivity, to improve output, to improve customer service, to improve revenues and profitability, etc. Not all of those will have been accelerated. In particular, any investments that require kind of longer term view and have a longer term payback, I'm pretty sure people have actually put on ice at the moment because they're uncertain about the future and they cannot afford right now to make big bets in their businesses. But the kind of thing that we're doing here, kind of remote conference calling, moving some of the work to be more hybrid between meetings and sort of remote working, and in particular, sort of enhancing the customer experience online has definitely moved at breakneck speed. And I think a lot of the clients we talk to say that they, in that context, in that kind of customer facing context, they have changed more in the last 6 months than they have changed in the last 6 years.
Okay.
Thanks. Yep.
Well, thank you very much for your response. You covered, I think, a lot of points there, and very interesting ones as well that I think we can all get some insight from. Now, let me ask you another question, which is what you think will be the significance of technology in income growth and improving well-being more generally for everyone in the society, not only for the ones in financial services and those that can work remotely?
So that's an incredibly huge question, obviously. How would I even start to tackle it? Well, one way to start thinking about it is through productivity and employment. Just because, conveniently productivity times employment equals GDP per capita. And so, thinking through those two different strands, I think is helpful. And so, generally speaking, there is an enormous amount of technology out there that is productivity enhancing. So, for example, McKinsey Global Institute estimates that globally about 50% of all the work being done, all the hours worked today could already be automated using existing technology. So we don't even need any kind of future fancy new technologies to show up, but even just applying existing technology. However, of course, potential is not the same as actual adoption of technology. And we see kind of very different trends in technology adoption across different sectors, across different types of businesses. And, we are almost seeing, and well, not almost, we are definitely seeing like a superstar effect. So some of the businesses that are more ahead in digital delivery, digital applications, they're all also now investing heavily into artificial intelligence and into automation and into end-to-end kind of redesign, customer interfaces, whatever. And of course, that means that the gap between kind of the frontier and the rest is likely to grow bigger, which has big implications for firms, of course, but also for employees. So that's one dimension, productivity. What the aggregate picture will look like is harder to say because the frontier businesses don't actually typically account for a very huge proportion of either GDP or employment in any particular country. So they might be charging ahead, but it's really the rest that matter for aggregate productivity. But generally speaking, all of this is likely to drive further productivity growth, which all other things equal, is a good thing. Now, the question then becomes, well, but is that going to come at the expense of employment? And our analysis is pretty confident that the answer in the medium to long term is no. It has never been the case that massive productivity improvements through technology have resulted in long-term kind of lower levels of employment. Actually, employment rates, so if you take total number of employed people as a proportion of all working age people, they've gone up in, I think it was 112 out of 115 countries that we analyzed. And in all those countries, productivity had also increased. So that's the big picture. But when you dig deeper, of course, individuals, specific businesses, specific towns, or specific sectors will probably see a kind of short-term reduction in the demand for their particular types of skills or their particular types of contributions. And that will, we think, likely exacerbate some of the geographical differences and some of the inequality issues that we have in society in the UK as well as in pretty much every other country. And so employment aggregates probably will continue to look pretty positive, but the challenges will be around kind of specific places, specific sectors, and the transitions that people will have to make. Specific demographics like older people who might be laid off and then find it hard to find new jobs. And you know, the degree to which that transition is either smooth or not depends an awful lot on government strategy as well as business behavior around things like retraining, things like recruitment, things like you know, the whole leveling up agenda. Now that's just a story about GDP, which is only a part, not the full story about well-being. And of course, we do know that a lot of these technologies could be incredibly powerful in delivering better climate change results. So reducing the costs in many cases of delivering the same service, for example, movement from A to B at 20 to 30% lower carbon emissions, or heating a building to the same level of kind of comfort for the people in it, but using much less energy. And so there are a lot of positives that our technology could deliver on the sort of more social and environmental fronts. But I think it will require both government sort of action and regulation as well as businesses to care about those kind of broader social and environmental aspects for any of that kind of potential to become a reality.
Thank you so much for that. It does make total sense, and obviously, it's such a big topic, and I'm sure we don't have enough time to really cover specifically all of it in detail. But maybe if you could just touch on a bit more about, well, you've mentioned it could exacerbate inequality. Are there ways to tackle that? Are there ways to prevent that from happening?
So, yes, there clearly are ways to tackle that and avoid it from happening, to stop it from happening, or at least mitigate some of the impacts. There are many dimensions probably to that, but let's start with understanding what causes the inequality. And I think the biggest reason why technology adoption and kind of wide-scale automation is likely to create inequality is that it tends to displace people or tasks that are primarily manual and low-skilled. And so it is those people who already have a lower level of education, a lower level of skill and employability, who are in jobs that are more likely to disappear. Whereas people who are in high-paying jobs, well, there's going to be even more work for them. So McKinsey Global Institute has done quite an interesting kind of synthesis analysis of what are the future skills that will be required in the workplace. So they've taken all the kind of 800 different occupations. They've used US data, but it's very relevant here in the UK as well, and said, well, what are the skills for those 800 occupations that are required today? What are the skills that might be required in the future? But more importantly, what is the shift in the mix of occupations we're going to be needing in the future? So for example, we're going to be needing many fewer data entry clerks, because basically we can just let computers do that automatically now, and people are probably worse at it than machines by now. On the other hand, we're going to need many more social care workers because of the aging population and demographic shifts, and also people's prioritization of health and well-being over and above of material things as they get richer, as they get more prosperous, and also as they get older. So putting those things together means that you're going to see a shift away from manual skills and away from kind of basic cognitive skills, the sort of thing that might require a human person to kind of match people on one spreadsheet to another spreadsheet kind of manually. You will need a lot less of that. You will need a lot more of kind of high-level cognitive skills, somebody who can design a whole system end-to-end for dealing with customer queries, for example, or someone who can figure out how to give at the front line patients the best possible care. So you will need those high cognitive skills, but even more, you will need social and emotional skills, because that's something robots will not get good at for a very, very long time. And humans have a comparative advantage in this. We already are good at it. So, and lots of people with no education are also very good at it, right? So, you know, actually it's a huge opportunity to create opportunities and jobs and, you know, good roles for people with slightly less education. And of course, tech skills, you know, inevitably we'll need more software engineers and data scientists and all those kinds of things, which is slightly more polarizing because it is unlikely that somebody who's working at, I don't know, warehouse shelf stocker at the moment will become a computer engineer, but they could well become a social care worker. They could well become a customer service official, you know, whatever. And so those kind of different skills being needed in the future are really going to drive the opportunities and the challenges. Sorry, I've kind of taken a very long time to explain what the problem is before getting to the solutions, but I think that does imply what the solutions are. The solutions, I won't speak for like, you know, should government do this or businesses or organizations do that? But I think first of all, training and skilling, upskilling and reskilling. It's a very sad truth that in the UK, for sure, the people who are already highly educated are the people who get by far the most training in their working lives as well. So at McKinsey, you know, you do like a week or two of training every year, but if you work as a, I don't know, bus driver, you probably get your training before you start your job and that's it. The shocking statistic that I learned this year is that 50%, so half of all the people in the bottom socioeconomic group, which people define as the D and the E group, 50% of them have had zero training since they left school, none. And so, like, how can we talk about lifelong learning and investing in our human capital and all the kind of importance of people centricity in this day and age if we're not actually investing in people? We're just investing in certain people and not in others. So investing in adult skills will be critical, and that could be investment by employers themselves. It can be investment sometimes by the individual, but it also must be investment by the government, who spends on average, I think something like, I'm going to say 2,000 to 4,000 because I don't remember the exact number, per person, per pupil in kind of primary, secondary education. If you take the adult population, the government spends £50 per person per year. Right. Well, you could say, well, it should be for the employers to spend all this money. And, you know, a lot of them do spend money. But as I said, it tends to have this kind of polarizing effect that employers spend the money on the people where they get the best return, which happens to be for them, the higher educated people. So training, upskilling, reskilling is going to be critical. I think from a business perspective, also being much more thoughtful about your recruitment practices. So if you're just fishing in the same pond of the very scarce number of, you know, data scientists or whatever it is, you're obviously going to have to pay very much for that. Whereas you could be much more expansive and look for people who have inherent skill and enthusiasm for certain jobs, even if they don't have the education. Because if you then train them up yourself, yes, that costs a bit of money, but actually the research that our colleagues have done suggests that those people are more loyal, they're actually better at the job, than the people who got a great education but haven't had the job specific training. And so businesses could be much more thoughtful and creative about where they recruit. And of course, ultimately as economists, we also need to think about redistribution. Now that's very much a political question, to which there is no right or wrong answer, and it's politically incredibly hard. The one thing I would say on that is, just redistributing money is not enough, in my opinion. So like you can redistribute money, but you cannot redistribute mental health, for example. And having a meaningful job is critical for mental health. So we sort of need to think much more systemically about what contributes to people's well-being and invest in all of those things, rather than just imagine that, just shipping money from people, a group of people who are doing maybe financially better to another is the only solution. It's only part of the solution.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to say how it's so fantastic to see you breaking down the problems into sort of so many different sides and just touching on so many different topics at the same time. I think it's super helpful for everyone. But yeah, Francisco, you go.
Yeah, right. First of all, before I ask another question, I'd like to thank you as well. It's very interesting to see all these things from different perspectives that we as economics students may not think of all of them, and may not think usually that all these issues about well-being as well, mental health, are part of economics. But truth is that economics encompasses everything, and we can all.
That's the fun thing about it, right? Anything can be economics if you wanted to. And by the way, I personally, because I've come through a fairly kind of unusual path to be an economist, right? I'm much more of an applied economist, and I've then kind of really grit the topic in my grown-up life and in my work and whatever. I am absolutely clear that just looking at GDP and output and all the kind of traditional quantitative metrics is not sufficient, because it doesn't actually explain the world. It does not explain the choices people make. And it doesn't explain what government should try and maximize. And so, really important that we do take that broader view. Now, sometimes you want to go deep and narrow, and that's fine. But sometimes you need to go much broader and outside of the kind of traditional GDP box.
Of course, that's very true. In order to really grasp the population's well-being, we can't just take output per head as really the most important measure, because it doesn't encompass a lot of other things. But so continuing as well, a question that I think a lot of students would want to know here is a tip that you could give us in general during these hard times of COVID-19 and getting recruitment. What do you think is the top tip that you could give students that are at university right now and that we're all feeling a little bit overwhelmed by generally internship applications, graduate job applications on top of COVID? And what could you tell all of us?
It's tough. I can totally imagine that, on top of all the kind of COVID messing up everybody's lives, it's then kind of throwing up this huge uncertainty about jobs for the future and so on. I would say, first of all, be reassured. There will be demand. Like all of our analysis suggests that there will be demand for people like you. I just mentioned this kind of higher cognitive skills being one of the huge big growth areas. And my kind of advice, but this is very much from my personal context and experience, so it could be wrong for you. Don't quote me on it, or sue me if it's wrong for you. But for me personally, thinking about things in a slightly less, slightly more multidisciplinary way has been incredibly powerful, because if you're working in business or if you're working in politics or policy, economics is one input to the decision-making puzzle, but it can never be the whole input. And I have enjoyed learning more about some of the other disciplines, so that I can, as an economist, I don't just bring the economics perspective, but I can say we've also taken into account all that other research, all that other thinking. And here's a genuinely evidence-based good set of thinking and policies that are evidence-based in the sense of having looked at all of the different disciplines. So it depends on what you want to do, but like portraying that willingness to be quite multidisciplinary, I think will appeal certainly to business employers, and probably up to a point to government as well, even though slightly depends on which kind of recruitment route you're considering. So, you know, be reassured that there will be jobs. I think it, you know, of course, could take a little bit longer to find the right ones. I would say that don't hesitate to do something for a little while. That may not be your dream job, but just to get the experience, just to learn about yourself. Because if you're thinking kind of long term, it sounds terrible right now to think about 6 months or a year. It sounds like a very long time for you guys, I'm sure. But at my age, it's no longer a long time. And so in that time, you can also learn a lot about yourself. And certainly if I were to kind of say, what is the, you know, at the heart of my success is that I have wanted to learn about myself. What is it I enjoy? What is it that I'm particularly good at just by nature? How can I find a job that like combines the two? Because there's nothing better than doing what you would do for free, but having somebody pay for it. And then of course, the more you do something, the better you get at it. So it's not like a, you know, it's a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. And so the sooner you learn in your own life, because we're all coming from different backgrounds and different kind of experiences, if you learn to kind of broaden out that set of experiences, look at other people and what they're doing, and kind of really get to know yourself, what you enjoy, what you're really good at, what you'd like to build on, then that can create a lot of energy for the future and creates a lot of opportunities as well, and then creates a kind of platform which you then have lots of options going forward.
Thank you so much. That's awesome. We're going to move on onto the questions that people have been posting. There's quite a few, some sort of really good ones. And the first one, unfortunately, goes back to the coronavirus and the sort of stimulus that we've had. And the question comes from Harris, and he's asking, how are we going to pay for the stimulus we've had? Are we going to see austerity, or are we going to see some sort of other measures like, you know, growing out, inflating our way out? If you could talk about that a bit, that would be amazing.
Sure, and it's an incredibly important question. It's a question that I've personally been putting on the back burner just because it's too like depressing to think about. I do think that right now the right response for the UK government in particular has been to just borrow more. Why? Because it's almost for free, right? The interest rate we're having to pay on bonds in the UK is very close to zero. And so in those circumstances, kind of makes a lot of economic sense to borrow more, especially if the returns on what you're spending this money on can be positive. And so the first thing I'd say is the government does gradually need to move away from spending on just supporting people's cash flows to spending on things that have a positive return. And having spent a lot of time as government chief economist in various places, there are enormous numbers of projects, not least the kind of investment on human capital that I mentioned, that actually have a positive return. So you may spend money on it today, but you get more back from it in the future, both in terms of GDP and output, but also in terms of tax revenues. And there are a vast number of things that government should now probably be thinking about shifting the spending to, which is sort of investments for the future that do create some jobs in the short term, such as infrastructure spending, but then actually improve productivity and well-being in the UK in the long term, such as around health and education. So anyways, that's a bit of a preamble to say I don't really know how we're going to pay for it, but implicit in my view about that is that we will pay for it by just, you know, making the right decisions now that allow us to grow the economy in the future. That will then kind of relatively more easily allow us to pay back the debts that we've taken on. I personally think that austerity, the way it was delivered, it had one or two positive side effects, but broadly was much too blunt an instrument in terms of delivering a balanced budget. and to start reducing the kind of debt levels that we were facing and will be facing in the future. I would say that there is probably at least 30% of government expenditure that is utterly and completely wasted. So my first way of paying for COVID would be to get rid of all the wasted expenditure. Now, political economy dictates that this is not possible because a lot of the money is being spent on things that people like and will vote for, but is actually not helping their well-being. So, but as a politician, if I were a politician, I would try and see how much we can actually just reduce the waste and the complexity which creates unnecessary cost in the government system. And then, for the medium long term, we really do need to boost productivity. And there's, multiple books and things that people have written, including me contributing to some of them as to how we might do that. Typically evolving around things like investment in education and skills, investment in some specific aspects of infrastructure, investing some specific aspects of R&D and innovation and commercialization and technology adoption. So all of those things sound like I'm just spending more money, and fair enough, but actually we think the returns are going to be large multipliers of the amount of money being spent. The UK is in an incredibly lucky position to be a relatively large economy that has gained over decades a very significant confidence in financial markets for its ability and willingness to ultimately pay back its debts. And that means that I think we can take our time, not forever. I mean, we need to be prudent as well, otherwise we lose that credibility. But, just cutting so much that you hurt the economy and you hurt the capability of the government to also deliver the necessary public services is unlikely to be the best strategy here.
Well, thank you very much for that response. I think we're now going to continue as well. We've got quite a few questions here. One from Anna. How realistic do you think a universal basic income is as a social safety net? And do you think an extended lockdown will encourage governments to implement it?
Wow, huge question. So I don't know if you happen to know, but I literally about a couple of weeks ago wrote an article on universal basic income because I wanted to look at the experiment that has been done in Finland. I'm originally from Finland, so I moved to the UK in '94. I'm actually currently in Finland for family reasons. We'll be back in London next Monday, but nevertheless, happen to be in Finland right now. So Finns have tested it. So the answer has two parts. I think, like in a theoretical world, I totally think a universal basic income would both be enhancing fairness and well-being significantly, very significantly, and would also be affordable. So in a theoretical world, that is for sure the case. The numbers absolutely add up. The reality, the political reality of it is horrendous, absolutely horrendous. Because the two things you'd have to do that politicians in most countries are unable to do easily is, first of all, you'd have to dismantle the existing social security system, because introducing universal basic income without taking away all of the other bureaucracy and all of the other supports and all of the other benefits that are already there is both unaffordable, because then you'd just be adding something on top of some expenditure you already have. And it kind of defeats the purpose, because the two key reasons I think universal basic income is a good thing is, one, you get rid of all the bureaucracy. It is not means tested at all. And therefore, you just don't need to have hundreds of people, both the people who need the money and the people who administer the money, administering anything. It just shows up on your bank account, full stop. And this would be at a significant cost saving. But the second thing that it is a significant improvement in the quality of life for the people who rely on the basic income. Right now, they have to fight a bureaucratic jungle of forms to be filled in, conditions to be kind of met, things they have to do in order to qualify, which at best is a hassle, at worst is very demeaning, actually, because you have to prove things that we don't ask other people to prove that they're worthy of, right? And so, you know, a lot of the huge positive well-being benefits of universal income have to do with the fact that people suddenly, they don't have to prove that they are worthy of being a member of society. They just get it without any questions asked, and it liberates them. It gives them an opportunity not to worry about whether they've got money for their children's, you know, lunch tomorrow, but actually they can start making longer term decisions. And this is a very well-known finding in poverty literature, that people who live in constant poverty and deprivation, they're just not able to make longer term decisions. It's not that they're stupid, it's not that they're not good in any particular way, it's just that it's not possible for your brain under stress to think outside the box and think expansively and think long term. And so anyways, as you can tell, I'm, you know, in principle, a huge advocate of some kind of safety net that is similar to a universal basic income, because it reduces stress and improves outcomes for all. And it actually, by the way, also increases trust in society, which is such a like absolutely core ingredient for well-being and GDP, by the way. The political hurdles are immense, absolutely immense. So the reason why I can't answer your question straight is because I don't see any system in the world where you could relatively straightforwardly introduce an basic income in a way that actually made sense. So eradicating all that bureaucracy and replacing all the existing sources of support. Let's hope that there's some kind of miraculous awakening in political classes that they work hard on this, because I think as an idea it's worth further pursuing.
Thank you. There's also a question about Sweden and their response to the crisis. And the question comes from Lean, and she or he asks if a voluntary lockdown in the UK would have been a good strategy. And just in general, what do you think about this kind of response that we've had?
Wow, very, very hard question, because the truth is that even as an economist, I don't know how we can fully model out what to expect from people's behavior. I mean, there are probably behavioral scientists, social scientists and others who have like the full fact base that would allow them to almost model collective behavior, but I don't have access to that data. And so would a voluntary lockdown have worked in the UK? Well, who knows? You have to start asking questions like, to what degree are people in the UK likely to think about themselves versus others? That is really at the heart of a voluntary lockdown, because the only reason for you, unless you're really, really old and you're in the risk group, the only reason for you to isolate is because you're protecting others. Now, so then you have to kind of think about, well, where in that kind of selfishness, selflessness spectrum people on average fall? And they of course fall, first of all, you know, kind of different nations will fall in different places on average, but then individual people will fall in different places as well. Personally, I actually have to admire the Finnish approach a little bit, because what they did was a really, really strict lockdown straight away, which then allowed them to kind of really stop the virus 100% in its tracks. And then they've just been following the science and easing the lockdown as far as they can, whenever they can. Obviously, Finland is completely different because the population density is like 1/100th of the UK, so it's a little bit of an unfair example. I don't know enough about the science to really think that herd immunity is a thing that we could rely on. I just despair at the lack of action in terms of the things we knew that would work, which is testing, tracking and tracing, and kind of more targeted isolation of people, which has still costs, but nowhere near the same costs as like a full-blown lockdown. I think going forward, hopefully we'll get more granular about that, because the virus is here to stay. I mean, until we get a vaccine, which is at least another, I don't know, 6-12 months away, we're going to need to keep finding ways to kind of deal with it as opposed to be free of it. But we shall see. I mean, this is going to be like, if you're so inclined and you want to do a PhD, like there's several decades worth of PhD material here, looking at what happened during this unbelievably big shock to the economy. There are a million interesting questions to be answered there, both on the kind of econometric side of trying to understand cause and effect, but also on the kind of more economic side of how did people react in terms of their, consumption, their investment, their, search for new jobs, how did businesses, etc., react. So bottom line is, I don't know, but it's certainly something that eventually we will be able to tease out from that data when the data starts to be available.
Well, thank you very much for your response on that one. So we have here another question from S, who says the PM was recently talking about making the UK being the Saudi Arabia of offshore wind. Do you think this is possible? And could you say a little bit about the decarbonization of the UK?
So, like, mathematically, it's not possible for the UK to be the Saudi Arabia of offshore wind, because, I worked in energy and climate change. So from like very broad recollection, Saudi Arabia probably holds at least 25 to 30% of all of the oil reserves in the world. And it happens to also hold the ones that are the best, in the sense that they're the cheapest to access. The UK does not hold that proportion of the world's wind reserves or offshore wind reserves. We hold a fair bit, like, on a list of countries, we would come up as, relative to our surface area and to our kind of offshore areas, we do pretty well, but we're not a big country geographically. Like, we're nowhere near as big as the US or Russia or China, just geographically. So it's technically not possible for us to be Saudi Arabia. Now, if we're thinking kind of penetration, so the proportion of energy that comes from offshore wind, then the UK does have an excellent offshore wind resource. We also have excellent companies that have invested in it over years in order to kind of get the technology to be cheaper and better. We have an excellent national grid that's probably going to be able to deal with the intermittency of wind, which is a critical challenge when you're dealing with a source of energy that is not, you can't just kind of turn it up and down. We have some kind of good research and advances in battery technology, what will make it better. We probably have the potential to become quite a rapid adopter of electric vehicles, which will serve as a battery, like a mass distributed battery for wind energy, which should be really excellent for the economics of low carbon energy. And we have a regulator and a government that understands all of this. So I think, and by the way, we also have a target to be zero carbon by 2050, which cannot be delivered without a huge investment and proportion of electricity coming from low carbon sources. Well, all electricity will have to come from zero carbon sources. And offshore wind is going to be a very competitive part of a portfolio of things that make up that. So I think as an aspiration, definitely it's worthwhile. And my understanding of the economics of offshore wind is that they're getting better and better all the time, and they are already fairly competitive with some of the kind of slightly more older versions of carbon producing energy. But they can't be 100% of our electricity mix. We have to have other sources as well.
Oh, that's perfect. Thank you. There's a question from Tim about the sort of environmental issues, and we see that so many consumers are sort of expressing their interests and their motivations, that on that topic. But do you see empirically this impacting demand for businesses, goods, and services?
Excellent question. So I think it slightly depends on the business and the sector, obviously. But if I have to generalize, there are few businesses and few sectors, let's put it that way, where it's really the driving force of companies' attempts at reducing their carbon footprint or improving their environmental credentials or reducing their impact on other types of pollution and kind of damage they might be doing to the planet. I would say that they're still doing those things, but I would say the major drivers are, first of all, Stakeholder pressure. In other words, shareholders starting to think that it's not sustainable from a shareholder value perspective for these businesses to be polluting and to be reliant on business practices that essentially exploit an externality that hasn't been priced in. And so they can see the kind of writing on the wall that at one point in time in the future, there will not be any kind of free clean water, and there will not be free clean air, and there will not be ability to emit carbon without paying quite a high price for it. So from a business shareholder point of view, there's a lot of people who are starting to think it's just not a good business strategy to be not environmentally friendly. And the second kind of really practical thing, well, actually, there are three. So there's the shareholder stakeholder pressure, there's the PR aspect, where I think less than customers walking away from, let's say, a BP or a Shell or whatever, those companies just feel, the individuals at the head of those companies feel that they cannot be associated, they do not want to be associated with a business that's seen to be dirty in that kind of environmental sense. The final reason is kind of a win-win situation. Like an awful lot of environmentally friendly technologies are actually cheaper in the long run than environmentally unfriendly technologies. So the Committee on Climate Change, as well as McKinsey, we've done our versions of understanding like what are all the different technologies and applications you would need to put in place to get to zero carbon for the UK by 2050. And it turns out that almost 50%, I think it's something like 30% of all of those things actually have a positive net present value. In other words, if you did them, they would pay back more than what they cost you in terms of cost of capital. Now, it's a huge and interesting dilemma to ask, well, why is it already not happening if it's all that kind of profitable? And I can speak to that in depth if necessary. There are sadly lots of things that are not happening in the world that should be happening if you just look at the incentives that people are facing. But the good news is that businesses are starting to realize that actually it's just going to be a lot cheaper for them to run a business that's environmentally friendly. And so they're the kind of the needs and the wishes of the consumers, of the shareholders, of the business, managers and bosses themselves, as well as the kind of society, are actually aligned. So those are the things that I would personally kind of continue to push really hard if I was in this policy area, because there's no better place to start than the areas that are super win-wins. And then of course you will need to move into the territory where there's some trade-offs, but if by then you've created a lot of wealth by tackling these win-wins, then you're in a better position to start doing something that people might feel is a bit more uncomfortable or more of a trade-off.
Well, thank you very much for that answer. It was very interesting insight. We see it's already 59. I'm not sure if we have time for maybe one last question, or is that all right?
Sure, I have time. If people have to drop off, then of course drop off. That's completely understood. But equally, I can stay on for a bit more, or let's say one more question, if that would be helpful to you.
Okay, let's see. You have let me see, an interesting question here from Harris. You mentioned the government economic response has in general been good, but after the 2007-2008 recession, economists were heavily criticized. Do you think we will be praised after this crisis, or will there be a similar outcome?
I think it'll be very different. The big difference between the financial crisis and this crisis is that the previous one arguably was caused by people's greediness, financial system, economists themselves, in as much as they were predicting a different kind of future. Whereas this pandemic and its impact on the economy is very, very straightforwardly not anybody's fault, right? It's certainly not the business's fault. It's not the economist's fault. And it's also not something that any reasonable person says should have been a base case scenario in projections prior to the pandemic taking off. It could have been a scenario that you kind of play with, but not your base case kind of central scenario. Now, in terms of the response, there will be a lot of criticism because economics is fascinatingly an area where there cannot ever be the right answer. Because if you think about economics as something that maximizes global welfare, well, we will never, ever, ever be able to go and ask 7 billion people on the planet, what happened to them this time and what would have happened to them under some counterfactual conditions. So it is not ever going to be possible to know whether the right or the wrong thing was done. I think there will be some lessons learned in terms of areas where fairly non-controversially something could have been done better, but there'll be lots of areas of controversy that we'll never be able to fully resolve through analysis. And so there will probably be different schools of thought and different opinions. And I think that's the fun thing partly about economics, that you can't be right or wrong. In some ways, a lot of it depends on how you interpret the data and what your personal judgment is. And in some ways, that also makes it it's a moral thing. Like, you have to think about what are your values, and through that lens, do you think the right thing or the wrong thing happens? And increasingly, when I look at the data, I do sometimes find some like shockingly wrong things that have happened that people maybe didn't even realize. But considering what the government could have done, given, you know, their background and how they were voted into power, you know, they could have gone into kind of, oh my God, we can't afford this, and we're just going to let all those businesses and people lose their jobs, and then we'll worry about them later, kind of thing. They didn't do that. They accepted that there's going to be some just like cash that needs to be pushed out in the short term, which I think was, you know, putting any party politics to one side, will have been objectively the right thing to do.
Well, I think that's a really good time to sort of finish up. First of all, thanks guys for all your questions, but most importantly, thank you so much, Tera, for being here with us today. You know, you've touched on a whole kaleidoscope of topics really, and I'm pretty sure that it's given some food for brain for a lot of people and to some topics to research and look into. So honestly, thank you so much. And it's been really, really inspiring this evening. So we hope you enjoyed it too.
Absolutely, a huge pleasure. And I do hope that I have a chance to meet any of you in the future, kind of face to face in a sort of more normal environment. And good luck to all of you with your studies, with your careers. It looks scary, but, you know, believe me, you'll do well. So I'm very confident of that.
Thank you so much
for taking the time